Hello and welcome to this video. In this video, we'll just give a quick overview of what are the general corporate governance guidelines that privately owned companies could implement to take the first step forward or to even enhance their corporate governance framework wherever they might be today, which has a lot of benefits. This document will cover the following key areas within general corporate governance. It will give an overview of what governance is, what its benefits are, as well as what do the board of directors really do. We'll talk about board structure and composition. What are the qualifications of the board members? We'll talk about the principal duties of the board of directors. What are the key responsibilities and authorities that the board of directors has? We'll talk about the tenure of the board. We'll talk about general board procedures. We'll talk about committees that the board forms. So it delegates a lot of its work to committees that it forms, such as a remuneration committee, an audit and finance committee, an executive committee. We'll go through that in a bit. So if we were to summarize the key function of governance in one simple line, that would be protecting a business and the interests of all its stakeholders. That's it. The key function of a governance framework is to protect a business and protect the interests of all of its stakeholders. And there is so much to learn about best governance practices just by observing what the big companies are doing. And so by looking at these big blue chip corporations, we can infer that the key aims for corporate governance and the board of directors for that matter are to protect the business and its resources through a set of rules that define relationships between shareholders, the board, employees, suppliers, creditors, any internal or external stakeholder that you can think of. 2, to ensure medium to long-term sustainability of the business, with or without its current leadership. And there are many ways that this aim could be achieved, starting with having a proper succession planning system in place, to automation, to having policies, procedures, processes, and systems, to having a risk management framework so that the business is not overly dependent on one person or on a very few number of people who hold all the power. So the third goal, the third aim for a robust governance framework is to reduce key man dependency and risk. And the term key man dependency or key man risk is often exhibited in smaller companies that are founded and operated by an individual who maintains all power and control over key decisions and who often is tied so much in day-to-day operations that they do not have time to focus on the bigger picture, on organic, inorganic strategic initiatives that could take the business from being a one-man show effectively to a self-sufficient institution that is running like clockwork. So this is what governance is in a nutshell, and this is what are the key aims from adopting a robust governance framework. So the first thing when you think about governance is the board of directors. And the board of directors is usually made up of executives. So these are people who are part of the management team that are involved in the day-to-day operations of the business. But not just that. On the board, you often have non-executive directors who are not involved in the day-to-day operations and are deemed independent. And these independent non-executive directors often have a lot of value to bring to the board. They are often experts in the field. They are experts about the industry. They are very well connected. They have often seen a lot of things that happen with businesses. They've often been exposed to a lot of recurring problems that businesses face. And so they have a lot of value add to bring in. And so these executive and non-executive board members share a responsibility to oversee and approve key decisions within the organization, as well as to act in the best interests of all shareholders and stakeholders. And when it comes to the composition of the board itself, a balanced approach between both the independent non-executive members and the executive members is ideal. And usually there's often regulatory and statutory requirements about the mix itself. And the reason there is regulation around that is because the regulator does not want the exact same management team to sit on the board and have majority, because that would create a conflict of interest. One of the key functions of having a board of directors is to oversee management. And therefore, having the right balanced mix is ideal. So what is the skill set that is often sought after for someone to be qualified to sit on the board and actually deliver as a board member? Usually it is a combination of many things. The first thing you want is to make sure that these members have the right background, skills, and abilities, that they are suitable to sit on the board. But you also need to take into account their character, their experience, their qualifications, their financial literacy, and other relevant skills and experience based on the board's needs. And here's why. Oftentimes, the board itself has to make decisions or approve stuff based on recommendations and requests from the management team. And so if it is able to review material objectively and opine on that material and give feedback and only approve things that the board is objectively convinced about, then it is obvious that they need to know what they're reviewing. Another key point is that they are responsible for evaluating management performance and that the management team is performing in an effective, efficient, and ethical manner. And the more they are privy to what the scope of work of the management team entails that is specific to the context of the company and to the environment or ecosystem in which the company operates, the better they are going to be able to evaluate performance and set key performance indicators or targets that are operational or financial for the management team. Another key point is that they need to understand the financial strategies and the challenges that are unique to the business. They need to be able to spot gaps or holes that the management team is unable to see simply because the management team would be too sucked into that bubble, whereas the board, especially the independent non-executive members sitting on the board, would be able to see things from a bird's eye view, which would help guide the management team or provide an added opinion or an added perspective that might have been missed. Another key duty for the board is to participate actively in board and committee meetings, and we'll talk about committees in this video a bit later. They are also responsible for helping in the selection of the chairperson and the chief executive officer of the company. Oftentimes, it could be the entire management team as well. The board is also responsible for approving whether or not a company will enter new markets, whether it will have any acquisitions, whether the company would be paying dividends to shareholders. Other duties would include ensuring that there's a management succession plan in place, monitoring and managing potential conflicts of interest within the company, managing and overseeing risk, as well as protecting stakeholder interests. And I'll give an example about what do I mean by saying protecting stakeholder interests. Let's say the company is publicly listed, but that the majority of the shares are owned by a very large company. This means that the minority or the retail shareholders do not have much voting rights or do not really have a say in what are the key decisions that are going to influence the direction the company is going to be taking. And so it is the board's duty here to make sure that the management team is acting in the interests of everyone, or that it is not acting only in someone's interest at the expense of other stakeholders. Next, we'll discuss the tenure of the board. And the reason this needs to be discussed is simply to answer this question. How often does a board member actually sit on the board? And the answer to that question is it's not that straightforward, because the longer a director has served, the better their understanding of the business and the more relevant their insights are about the company itself and the ecosystem in which the company is. However, you also kind of want to make sure that nobody stays in a position of power forever, because the longer the board stays, the more rigid their mindset becomes in a way. And so oftentimes you would benefit as a company if you bring in fresh blood with new perspective to challenge the status quo, especially when growth and performance is no longer headed in the direction it once was. Next, we want to talk about board procedures, and this is going to give you a flavor of some of the steps that the board and its members and its committees need to take in order to fulfill their duties. So for example, the board will meet at least X times a year. However, if necessary, if they need to approve items that are urgent that could not wait till the next meeting, they will meet more frequently. Prior to each meeting, the board will set an agenda with all the items that need to be discussed, reviewed, etc. And each director is entitled to propose topics that are not on the agenda to be discussed at the next meeting. It is important that the directors are given or are handed their agendas before the meeting itself, along with all the supporting information that they need to review in order to make better informed decisions, so that they can come to the meeting prepared, have their questions ready, and prevent key timelines from being missed or key decisions from being missed. Board members as well need to make sure that whatever they have going on, aside from their board seat or their board responsibilities, does not materially interfere with their ability to do their job, because board members are often busy, and oftentimes you have members that sit on multiple boards as well as hold positions of consultancy or employment even as executive team members on different companies. And what you want to make sure is that they are giving their time and energy in a way that ensures their duties are fulfilled towards that board and that specific company itself. Another point here is that board members will have access to the company's management and employees, and that they will have the authority as a board to hire, retain, and obtain legal counsel, as well as engage external advisors wherever necessary or appropriate. And the last point in this section is regarding confidentiality. The board members are required to maintain confidentiality and to comply with the Code of Business Conduct and Ethics of the company. So what is this saying? It's saying that just because they're sitting on the board and they are holding the management team accountable does not give them any kind of privileges to break the Code of Business Conduct and Ethics of the company itself. The next idea on the corporate governance guidelines in this video pertains to the board committees. And the board committees is nothing but a subset or a committee that is formed by the board of directors that is tasked with something very specific in order to reduce the burden on the board and make the board itself more able and free to focus on more urgent and pressing matters. So what are examples of committees that we could think of? For the purpose of this video, we're going to talk about only 3 just so that you can have an idea. The first one is the executive committee. So this committee is the steering committee of the board of directors. And what is the purpose of this executive committee? It is simply to vet any request, any supporting documents, or any approvals that are sought from the board before they are actually sent to the board and discussed in the board meeting. So you should think of this as a committee that simply acts as a filter so that whatever goes to the board from the management team or from the company has been already vetted by that committee. The next committee is the audit committee. And the audit committee ideally should contain independent, non-executive board members, as well as people who are experienced in finance and accounting, such as the chief financial officer. And the core goal for that audit committee is to manage financial reporting, to manage risks, to manage the internal audit process, and even selecting and overseeing external auditors. As you can expect, if a board is meeting 4 times a year for, say, 3 hours or 4 hours, ensuring that proper oversight for financial reporting, internal audit, risk management is going to consume a lot of time. And so by delegating such responsibilities to the audit committee that is formed by the board and which reports to the board ultimately is one way of ensuring that whatever could be offloaded to a competent group of individuals will be offloaded so that the board itself frees up more time for more pressing, urgent matters. And the last form of committee is the remuneration committee, often referred to as a compensation committee as well. And this committee is primarily focused on remuneration, on pay for the executive team, on incentives, rewards, targets, etc. So you would want members of this committee to be knowledgeable about remuneration structure, about incentives, and you also want this committee to be composed primarily, or the majority of the members of this committee need to be independent, non-executive members, because these members are effectively responsible for the pay of the executive team. So you wouldn't want the executive team deciding its own pay. The next key idea within the corporate governance guidelines for a company is about management oversight and succession planning. So, as discussed, the board of directors are going to hold the management team accountable and ensure that they are acting in the interest of all stakeholders. And so performance is going to be determined in a very objective, scientific way. So, for example, executive team performance may be based on pre-agreed targets and/or key performance indicators that could be operational or financial in nature. And it is best practice for these targets, and operational as well as financial, key performance indicators to be not only specific to the company, but specific to the executive team members themselves. So, for example, the CFO might have a financial key performance indicator that pertains to achieving a certain minimum level of operating cash flow, or even by completing the annual report of the company by a certain date. The COO might have a key performance indicator based on the number of products they can sell in a given period, or might have a task, a key performance indicator that is operational in nature for a given period, which would entail ensuring the implementation and integration of an enterprise resource planning system that ensures interdepartmental collaboration and that the company is working seamlessly and more effectively. And there's going to be a section on KPIs in an upcoming video, as well as a template that I will share with you. And the last point with regards to management oversight and succession planning is to include, as part of the governance guidelines, a component of leadership development and succession planning to ensure that the organization structure of the company is not overly dependent or reliant on a very small group of people, to the point that if they leave for whatever reason, the operations would be disrupted. And so this is a key core component for the board to oversee and ensure there's a succession planning framework in place. So this was a very quick overview of what would be typically included in corporate governance guidelines of a company. Obviously, these guidelines need to reflect the state of the company itself, because a publicly listed company would have guidelines that are very different than a small privately owned company that is run by its founder. And so the key takeaway from this video, and for the rest of our discussions that pertain to corporate governance, is to remember that the key goal for corporate governance is to ensure that a company and its resources are protected at all times, that the business is sustainable in the medium to long term with or without its current leadership, and that it's not overly dependent on very few individuals, but rather it is dependent on a set of policies and procedures and processes and systems. In other words, moving a company from a one-man show to an institution.